We're running our society in conflict with this force. And the polycrisis, in my way of seeing it, is simply the evidence, the consequences, the symptoms of running our global economy, our global societies in conflict with the patterns and principles that explain how life actually works.
On today's episode, we speak with John Fullerton, an unconventional economist, teacher, writer, impact investor, and a former banker. He's one of the key thinkers behind regenerative economics. John wrote a book, Regenerative Capitalism: How Universal Patterns and Principles Will Shape the New Economy, as well as the book on Finance for a Regenerative World. Together, we dive into how adopting a more holistic view on economics and finance can bring us closer to a regenerative world, and how businesses can create conditions for life in their organizations.
And I think our listeners are really going to see that everyone in refi, especially as we know it in the Web3 world, can go and learn a thing or two from John's definition of refi, because he really offers a powerful foundation for regeneration. And what I thought about a lot during the episode is how important it is not to start with technology just for the sake of it, and how we should always find ways, as you said, Maya, to create conditions for life and shift not just from extractive finance, but also from extractive culture and extractive mindsets.
So let us know your take on regeneration, leave a comment, and share the episode to continue this conversation. Now, let's jump into the episode.
Hello, John. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Teresa. Good to be with you.
I wanted to welcome John to our episode today. John is an unconventional regenerative economist, teacher, writer, also impact investor, and a former banker. So I'm excited to touch on some of that personal story. And I also had the opportunity to take your course on regenerative economics, and we're so honored to have you on our show.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Awesome. So, John, I want to start by setting the stage by talking about maybe the flaws in traditional economic systems. So, can you maybe tell us why do you think we need a shift towards regeneration, and share a little bit about your personal journey, going from Wall Street to founding the Capital Institute?
Sure. Well, I guess the short version is I had a wonderful career for about 20 years at what I always call the old JP Morgan. Went there right out of college and caught the derivatives wave early, and I worked in Tokyo, London, New York, and all before derivatives became a dirty word, really. And it was an exciting time to be in the business. It was a tremendous opportunity for young people who knew how to run spreadsheets when our bosses didn't. And I have nothing negative to say about it. And Morgan was a great culture back then, high integrity bank. And sort of, if I were to try to convince people today what it was like, they wouldn't believe me, because the business has deteriorated rapidly or dramatically since then in terms of ethics and behavior. And of course, with the financial crash, it sort of changed the world's perception of Wall Street. I left in 2001, and I really left on intuition. There was no single event other than the merger with Chase, which kind of made it easy for me to leave with my stock options intact. But I had been thinking about leaving the business for a while, so it was kind of my excuse to step out. And I knew nothing about the environmental crisis when I left. I thought of it as save the whale, save the owl. But I didn't know anything about system science, and I had already begun getting involved in what we now call impact investing. And I actually had a meeting. The first meeting I left in the spring of 2001. And the first meeting I had to think about what I wanted to do next was in Lower Manhattan with a guy who ran a charter school company. And I was thinking about getting involved in the charter school phenomenon. And that meeting happened to be at 9:30 in the morning on a beautiful sunny day in New York that was 9/11. And so I experienced 9/11 up close and personal. And that really pushed me into what I would call a deep think phase of my life that lasted years, trying to figure out what was going on in the world and why the narrative of what I'd learned at Morgan didn't seem to be credible or plausible or continuable. Something big was changing and I didn't understand it. And I started reading books. And it was then that I discovered system science, complexity science, the environmental crisis as a systemic issue. And I read a book called Limits to Growth, which, is starting to get a bit of a re-examination, but it was written in the 1970s. And it essentially said that exponential growth on a finite planet can't go on physically. And it was completely discarded at the time when it came out, but it struck me like a laser beam that it had to be true, and it was physics. And secondly, that as a financier, it was finance, the financial system, the finance algorithm, let's call it, that was driving exponential growth. So it was guys like me who thought they were so smart, they were actually driving the algorithm that was going to wreak havoc on life on this planet. And I've been wrestling with that challenge ever since, what we now call the meta crisis, but it really is rooted in the incongruity of our economic model and the physical realities of life on a finite planet. So that's now been, over 20 plus years. So if I'd had it figured out by now, if I was any good at what I'm doing, I'd have it figured out by now. But I think this is a rest of our lifetime challenge.
Oh, yeah. The meta crisis is real. And so it sounds like from that deep thinking period of your life, you switched to this idea of we need a paradigm shift to regeneration, right? And that's what your work is all about. And you often say, in the course and in your work, that regeneration is not just a new trendy word for sustainability, right? And I share your concern that I'm afraid regeneration can become this new buzzword of greenwashing. So for our listeners who might not fully understand what regeneration is, how would you describe it in simple terms?
Well, the simplest way I would describe it is one word: life. And if you allow me a couple more words, the process that allows life to continue. And that's really profoundly important. Life is a process, and modern science, living system science, there's many sort of varieties of science, disciplines of science that all contribute to an understanding of how life works. But it's all very new in the scheme of science. It's certainly 20th century. I think the word ecology first showed up. I don't know what that is, but it's sort of like almost in my lifetime is the field of ecology, has it become a field? And there are many discoveries that are happening in the 21st century, particularly around the physics underlying how life works. So for example, the 2022 Nobel in physics was awarded around this idea of entanglement, which in simple language is that everything is connected to everything. Well, if that's true, and that's now accepted science, that profoundly changes all of the mechanistic assumptions in our economics and in our finance. And so the whole discipline of economics and finance, which, by the way, is not unique to economics and finance, it actually extends to all of our mechanistic approaches to the disciplines. Think of healthcare. There's a new, really, renaissance in healthcare, which people refer to as holistic medicine. That's the same story playing out in the health of our bodies. I'm talking about the story, how it plays out in the health of the living system we call an economy. And so I think we're in, as Maya knows, I talk about this being a change that's as big, if not bigger, than the shift from the medieval age to the modern age. This is a whole new way of thinking and seeing that is actually not new. It's actually as old as our indigenous wisdoms. It's actually reconnecting with the wisdom that we have always known. But we, in a sense, in our excitement about the scientific discoveries that began with the scientific revolution, we've lost track with this other way of knowing, this holistic way of knowing. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. The reductionist method, what we call the scientific method, is brilliant for solving mechanistic problems like how to make a cell phone. But it fails when we try to use it to manage complex systems like our own bodies or an organization, a company, a government, the United Nations, our families. It fails. And actually Einstein himself warned us of that. But we've become so enamored with this sort of left brain analytical reductionist process that we use it as a tool, and we've in a sense allowed it to take over the way we see the world. And if I have to interject a concern about the refi movement, it's born out of that same left brain reductionist approach to problem solving. And so anyone in the refi movement that's not even aware of this distinction is certainly going to fall into the trap of reinforcing this reductionist approach to problem solving. And in fact, given the power of the technology, it'll not only reinforce it, it'll accelerate it. And this is one of my biggest concerns now with the rise of AI, because the AIs, if they're constructed with reductionist thinking only, they're going to exponentially accelerate the bias toward reductionist problem solving. And just to be clear, I'm not against reductionist problem solving so long as we use it for the right type of problems. So if you want to put a man on the moon, it's brilliant. God help you if you don't use it. If you want to build a bridge, if you want to build a building, if you want to build an AI, you're going to need to use reductionist problem solving. But that doesn't mean it explains how the world actually works. And the regenerative process is it's a single word that comes closest that I've found from studying this quite deeply to explain the process of how life actually works. And so, as a reminder, we're having a conversation only because both of your bodies and my body are regenerating in real time during this conversation. Otherwise, we're not having a conversation. And it turns out that's true not only of all life on this planet, but increasingly there's increasing conviction. This isn't accepted science yet, but increasing conviction that this is true across the entire universe. And in fact, it may be true across multiple universes. I don't know, that doesn't matter for our purposes. But the point is, this is a massive, powerful force that explains life. And we're running our society in conflict with this force. And the polycrisis, in my way of seeing it, is simply the evidence, the consequences, the symptoms of running our global economy, our global societies in conflict with the patterns and principles that explain how life actually works. And as a last thought on this, it kind of didn't matter as much when the economy was relatively small in scale compared to the scale of the biosphere of the planet. Just like if you go into a forest and cut down a few trees, it doesn't matter. But if you go into the same forest and keep cutting down trees long enough, suddenly there's no more forest. And I think our global economy and the material throughput of the economy, not the GDP, the material throughput, energy, matter throughput, including the waste that we leave out as a result of the economy, including carbon in the atmosphere, is now at a scale that it's breaking the planet. And the human, because the finance algorithm demands continuous growth in returns on capital, the longer we play this out and in a sense, the more we've harvested the low-hanging fruit, the more it has to become extractive on people and planet in order to continue that process. So we don't even need to get into the ethics and the morals of whether capitalism is good or bad and why it is what it is. The physics don't work because of the scale. And so that to me was the realization that we need to fundamentally change paradigms, because the current system, even if we fiddle around the edges with ESG and alternative measures of growth and blah, 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 the physics don't work. And, that's now being proved out. The 20 years into the circular economy, really 30 or 40 years into the circular economy, and the economy is less circular than it was when we started talking about it. And we've got way more renewable energy, but we've also got more non-renewable energy because the scale is wrong. And so carbon emissions keep going up. And maybe just a last comment. I mean, I learned about this through my work with agriculture. And so the insight was that this can work in the field of regenerative agriculture. In my case, working with the Savory Institute and this idea of holistic planned grazing on the world's grasslands. And I said to myself, literally standing out in Montana, looking out over thousands of acres of grasslands, if this can work in the system we call the grasslands, why couldn't it work on the system we call the economy? And that's where the insight came from, literally standing in a pasture in Montana, which is crazy because I have no real affinity to ranching and cows and cowboys. I'm a coastal creature.
Wow. I imagine that image in my head right now. Beautifully said, John. And there's a lot to unpack. And I kind of want to bring the bigger idea of regeneration as a process, as connecting to life, to narrow it down a bit to economics and finance specifically. And like you rightfully mentioned, the refi community draws a lot from these ideas on regenerative economics. And the word refi literally stands for regenerative finance. And you technically are outside of this Web3 ecosystem world, yet you did write a paper on finance for regenerative world. So in your view, what is regenerative finance exactly? And also, maybe if you can explain to our audience, why is finance important in the context of regeneration?
Okay, so there's a lot there. First of all, you're right. And your listeners, if they haven't already figured it out, will figure out that I don't consider myself technically savvy. In fact, there's sort of an irony in my story of being a early derivatives professional, because some of my colleagues used to joke that I've got to be the only guy running a derivatives desk on Wall Street who doesn't know where the on-off button is on his computer. But I'm not adverse to technology, but it's not my passion. And so when I wrote the paper you're describing, which is really a book, it's available on the website, it was the sequel to Regenerative Capitalism. So I wrote in 2015 my first kind of serious piece on this idea. And I called it Regenerative Capitalism in part to try not to put off people who are massive fans of the capitalist system just by naming it something else. So but it's really not capitalism as we know it. Capitalism as we know it is now very much driven by this finance algorithm. So it's hard to imagine, capitalism doesn't need to be driven by a finance algorithm, meaning a optimized risk-adjusted return to capital algorithm, but that is the way it works really ever since my involvement in the business. It actually transformed to that during the 1980s, and I was a part of that transformation. So you can at least in part blame me and my generation. But corporations and investors used to have different purposes other than simply maximizing relatively short-term risk-adjusted returns on capital. But that approach actually works very well in the short term on an individual corporate company basis. So we talk about creating shareholder value, and we can criticize the shareholder value paradigm all we want, but we also have to acknowledge that it actually works. You can optimize for stock prices and make management decisions that, at least in the short term, for individual companies will be very positive for that stock price. And the whole leverage buyout phenomenon that started in the mid 80s and has continued to this day, but really picked up steam in the 90s, was essentially extracting value out of companies that was sitting there to be taken, which had this short-term positive impact on stock values, company values, and therefore investment returns, but arguably horrendous long-term consequences, not just for companies, but for all stakeholders of companies, employees in particular, research and development budgets, innovation, but also the environment. And we moved a lot of manufacturing to Asia. That destroyed a lot of jobs. The current political environment is a direct consequence of that, in my opinion. And we moved a lot of manufacturing to places like China, where it's probably worse on the environment than it would have been had it stayed in the United States. So we did all these things that were really good for the value of companies and therefore the returns to investors, but at a cost. And so getting back to your question, the finance book, Finance for a Regenerative World, where I did talk about what I would call regenerative finance, had nothing to do with Web3. In fact, I'm not even sure I knew what Web3 was when I wrote that. I'm not sure it existed. I don't know when Web3 started. I think I wrote that in 2018. So it was probably right around that time, would be my guess, right? And so what I mean by regenerative finance is it is a practice of finance that is in service to a regenerative economy. Nothing more and nothing less. Because there's no such thing as regenerative finance absent a regenerative economy. There can be regenerative finance, there can be regenerative projects as opposed to degenerative projects. But the whole point of regenerative finance is to use finance, and in particular investment. Think of investment as the bridge. If we have an economic system today and we want a different economic system in the future, investment is the bridge from today to the future. So how we invest capital today, do we build a highway or do we build a train? Do we build, more fossil-based coal mines, or do we build renewable energy? Do we build a building that is, energy inefficient, or do we not build a building at all and repurpose existing buildings? Do we build new cities and leave other cities empty, or do we repurpose half-empty cities? These are the big decisions that we need to make, and they're not just about finance. Finance. One of the things about the regenerative paradigm and life is it's holistic, it's fractal. So there's no such thing as regenerative finance systemically that absent the process to lead to a regenerative economy. And I think we, again, in our left brain reductionist, we start working on projects or deals that may or may not be regenerative. But if they're not moving the economic system toward a regenerative system, they're just, at best window dressing, reshuffling the deck chairs. And I made a very conscious decision when I first had this kind of awareness about what we now call the polycrisis or the meta crisis, that I only wanted to work on something that, no matter how far-fetched and, boil the ocean type thing it appeared, that if it succeeded, it would actually make a difference. And I think what I would encourage us all to do is really have a hard, honest question for ourselves as to, if we're successful in what we're doing, will it actually matter to the scale of the polycrisis? And I think the answer to that is often yes, because everything's connected to everything again. But sometimes we kid ourselves about what we're doing as to what impact it can actually have. And it's easier to make ourselves busy doing things within the current paradigm than it is to actually challenge and change the paradigm. It turns out changing the paradigm is profoundly difficult.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, John. And I wonder, what do you feel like today is the corporate world's take on regenerative economics? Because the first time I actually learned about your work was also on a podcast where I remember you were talking about, having these conversations with some of the biggest corporates in the world, which to many people could seem far-fetched and extremely challenging. So I want to know, how do these conversations usually go?
Well, it would be wrong to think that I have a lot of conversations with big multinational corporations. I find it incredibly difficult to figure out how to, let me start by saying I have a huge amount of sympathy and empathy for a large public corporation that's sort of trapped in the current finance algorithm system. And, watching Unilever over the last 10 years is a perfect case in point. Here you have a CEO in Paul Polman who, you're not going to find someone more committed and more passionate and more driven to transform a big company. And, he had to do it in the context of a public company. And first he had 3G, essentially activist investors trying to upset the apple cart, and he fought them off barely, although ended up having to make many of the changes they wanted to make to get the stock price to pop. And then he left, and now, Unilever has just been essentially assaulted by another activist investor, and they've just cut, I forget, a third of the senior management team. And so it's the same playbook of Carl Icahn in the 1980s, only it's dressed up not as corporate rating, but as activist investing. And so how you do this inside if you're a big business that's got a lot of material throughput, like, many big corporations have, and you're trying to change, we used to pretend that, there's a business case and we can make money while we do this. And, it's all going to be good. That's just naive. This isn't all going to be good. And if we're serious, there's going to be a lot of companies whose stock prices go down, and no CEO or board wants to hear that. So, I'm not exactly on the top of their invite list because they don't want to hear what I have to say if they've ever even heard of it. But I'll share one quick anecdote. I gave a talk to it was a board and senior management of a fairly large, I probably won't say where it was, but a bank you've all heard of. And I was invited in, and I had, 20 slides prepared and then plenty of time for conversation. And before I got through the first slide, I got interrupted by the most senior guy in the room, and he was attacking me. And it was pretty rude, first of all. And second of all, it's clear that I had triggered something in him. And all I can say is the old expression, first they ignore you, then they try to kill you, then you win. I think we may have entered into they're going to try to kill us, not literally, but figuratively phase. So, I've been at this for, that first thing I wrote was in 2015. I think slowly, certainly the word is penetrating into the corporate world. Some of the big consulting firms are writing white papers around it. So it's getting some traction, but the understanding of what it is and what it implies is still in the very early days.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to keep having these conversations. And thank you, John, for offering such a clear take on some of, for some maybe vague terms and terms that are a little bit hard to understand or visualize on concrete examples. And speaking of terms, you mentioned that we need to invest to realize the outcome we want in the future. And you also mentioned impact investing, but now we're also talking about regenerative investing. So can you clarify then what is the difference between impact investing and regenerative investing in the context of ESG? How do we avoid greenwashing here? And so why do you think we need to move beyond this idea of impact investing?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that we should be careful not to force these into buckets of good and not good, or good and less good. And I'll use an analogy. If you're in a car accident and you're bleeding to death, you better get to a hospital quick and arrest the disorder, to use Carol Sanford's expression. There's sort of an emergency arrest the disorder in order to have a chance to live a better day. And a lot of the work in the sustainability world, and I would put, planetary boundaries, that's an arrest disorder boundary calculation. You don't get a regenerative economy by not destroying the planet. You just don't destroy the planet. So I'm a huge fan of planetary boundaries and, massively support that we use that as our framework. It's better than any other framework we have on the ecological limits. And there are many versions of, what are called social floors objectives, end poverty and slavery and child labor, every child gets an education. All these objectives, all these goals are great, but also they're in a sense still in the mode of arresting the disorder. We have poverty. We want to arrest that disorder. So all of those things, as I see it, are embedded in the regenerative paradigm, because you don't, if you were bleeding to death, we are not able to have this regenerative conversation. But just because you're not bleeding to death doesn't mean you're regenerative. And so I'm always very careful not to criticize, the circular economy is reducing the disorder, but it doesn't create a regenerative economy. It reduces the degenerativeness of the current economy. But there's this pesky second law of thermodynamics that says that you can't just keep recycling at no cost. Every time you recycle, you use material, you use energy. So there's low-hanging fruit, but every time you harvest a piece of fruit, the next piece of fruit gets harder to harvest. And that's what we've learned after 20 years of trying to implement circular economy. So if you then move to impact, that shifts into kind of the do good framework. And that's great. God bless us. We should all be working on stuff that is good. But when we try to do something that we think is good inside the existing frame of our understanding of how life works, it's still not regenerative. It's still in this materialist, I'm going to start a company that's going to end poverty in Cambodia, or I'm going to start a company that's going to roll out solar panels in Nigeria. All of that is doing good, but it doesn't mean that we're tapping into this idea of regenerative potential. And the simplest way I can explain the distinction is that the regenerative paradigm is about creating conditions for health to emerge. But we have to focus on it. It's about potential. And by definition, potential is something we can't quantify in advance because we don't know what it is. And that sounds uncertain, undefinite, unpredictable, unscientific, unverifiable, unmanageable. And my answer to all that is yes. That's why this is so hard. But think about what would be a good example. Well, to take an individual's health. When you go to the doctor, the doctor takes blood samples, measures all kinds of things in your blood, takes your heart rate, takes your blood pressure, listens to your heart rate. They're testing for things that give them indicators of whether you're fundamentally healthy, not because you care that your blood pressure is whatever, 180 over 20 versus 120 over 80. Those are just numbers that are irrelevant to you. What you care about is, can you manifest potential as a human being and do whatever it is that, you're meant to do in this world? And if you're like me, what you think you're meant to do in this world when you're 30 is not what you're going to be doing in this world when you're 60. And that's, I'm living out regenerative potential that I never anticipated when I walked out the door of JP Morgan in 2001. And I'm way happier than I possibly could have imagined being in 2001. The idea of regeneration is that's the essence of how life works. All life is that it evolves, it develops into things that are unknown in advance, and it adapts and responds to changing contexts. And so it's not an engineering project. The process in living systems is referred to as emergence, where a system emerges into a new state, which is as simple as, water. You turn up the heat on the stove and the water goes from water to steam. It boils. We've turned up the heat on the system. So the economic system is going to change into a different phase. The more we keep heating the system, both literally and metaphorically, the more pressure, the more likely it is that it's going to change. But we don't know what that change is going to look like. It's the analogy I'm using these days is it's like we're having to facilitate a metamorphosis, but unlike the caterpillar, we don't know what the butterfly looks like yet. But what we can do is create the conditions for life and health to emerge. And that's why the first principles I talk about in the course are so fundamental. I believe we need to focus more on aligning with patterns and principles of how living systems work and hold our goals and our metrics a little bit more loosely. Now, we still need goals, but assume they're wrong rather than right, and dance with the complexity, because things are going to change in ways we can't possibly anticipate. I mean, just look at this country versus what you thought would be happening 5 years ago in this country. But that's complexity. That's the nature of complexity. And, this isn't the place for a full ecology dissertation, but the key is, and here's my counsel to the regen community, is start with life. Start with understanding how life works. You actually need to learn about ecology in order to do refi, if it's truly going to be refi.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious if you have any insights into how maybe organizations, and it can be even small businesses, can, start this organizational shift towards regeneration. And if you've perhaps seen any successful examples, or if you have like a favorite example of a company that has really gone through this transformation.
Yeah, I'm wondering if I should how much of this I should share. Yeah, I don't think he would mind. There's an AI company called Kiran, and one of the founders took the course and then joined our incubator program. And he and his partner have decided to focus their AI essentially on a living systems approach to AI. In other words, what they're going to feed into the AI is knowledge that is aligned with this living systems worldview, a more holistic worldview. And they're doing a lot of other things, but we're working with them actually on this. And they sort of paused their whole business plan development strategy to shift it into alignment with this regenerative paradigm. And the place that starts is really the culture of the company itself. So it's not just the products and services of the company. As Maya knows, in the sustainability world, we spend 90% of our time on the products and services. And I argue that we need to spend time on the business model. So the example I love to give is that, Google is inherently a regenerative product and service. Search is highly regenerative. It empowers the participation of masses of people and equips them with information so they can participate in this evolution of the economy in ways that were impossible before Google, before the internet, and before search. The internet itself is fundamentally a regenerative technology. Circulation of not only matter and energy, but information is, think of it as the oxygen in your body. Circulation is fundamental to life. And so the internet is regenerative tech, except the business models we've used to monetize the finance algorithm that has driven the business models, the extractive advertising business models, makes Google and Facebook regenerative companies, in my opinion, even though their product and service is actually could be quite regenerative if they had a different business model. So at any rate, the product and service layer, the business model layer, the capital structure layer, leveraged buyouts forced businesses to be much less resilient than they were when they had more equity than debt in their capital structure. So leveraged buyouts, all else equal, are extractive and degenerative as opposed to regenerative. But then it gets to culture. And any organization, just like the economy is a living system, every company is a living system. And this is not a new idea. People have been talking about corporations or companies as living organisms for a long time. So if living systems follow these same patterns and principles that I talk about and others talk about, why wouldn't we want to organize a company around those same patterns and principles? And we can monitor the company's health, just like we can go to a doctor and take our blood pressure. Well, what are the attributes of health in a company? Well, circulation of information. How well does the company communicate with its own employees? You ask any employee in most companies today, and they'll tell you that communication is terrible and probably not trusted. So that's an easy, low-hanging fruit place to start, not just because John thinks it's culturally wise to have better communication in a company. It's actually aligning with how life works. If our cells don't communicate accurately with each other, we get cancer and we die. So it's applying that same idea to a corporation. How does the energy flow around a corporation? And we can measure that. So culture is really the place to start. And that's true no matter what business you're in, tech or not tech. You can be an oil and gas company and have a regenerative culture, even though your product and service is not regenerative. I suspect that doesn't exist on the planet.
That's a great example. And I love that you mentioned technology as well, because that's a great pretext for me to segue into the next topic. I would love to hear your thoughts about kind of Web3, based on how you've interacted with different kind of blockchain projects or the technology itself. Because in your work, you say that money is a technology. So can you also explain what you mean by that? How does that lead to the idea of cryptocurrencies and all that?
Yeah, so the cryptocurrency thing has really confused me, to be honest. But there's one thing that's crystal clear to me, and that is that a monoculture money system, like the US dollar system, just like any monoculture, is not resilient. So, in fact, there was a wonderful man and a colleague named Bernard Lietaert who passed away probably in 2019. He's actually the man that invented the euro. And his idea for the euro was not as a alternative currency to national currencies. His idea for the euro was as a complementary currency. But the politicians decided, for a bunch of reasons, some of which probably made some sense, but they wanted to unify Europe around a single currency. So the idea turned into get rid of the domestic currencies and replace it with this single currency, out of a paradigm of we need a competitive currency with the US dollar. And we've got China rising. And so we need, in a sense, bolt ourselves together into a single currency zone. That's sort of an idea born out of a competitive left brain reductionist paradigm as opposed to a more collaborative paradigm. But, the world's a tough competitive place. I can understand that. But that wasn't Bernard's idea. And his idea is completely aligned, even though he didn't know about this regenerative idea when he developed it. When he learned about regenerative thinking, including from some of the same people I learned it from, he immediately saw that complementary currencies were a manifestation of regenerative living systems thinking in the money system. And the money system in a money-based economy is obviously profoundly important. And so the idea was to have multiple currencies complementing the dominant currencies that would adapt and respond to changing contexts in different ways, essentially to create shock absorbers and flexibility in the global money system. And in fact, before crypto came along, there were lots of experiments already happening with complementary currencies. And the story I loved is when Japan kind of hit the crash in the late 80s, in response to the economic crash, the banking system contracted. And when the banking system contracted, there was a massive need for short-term credit in the business community and in individual household communities. And there's something like 600 complementary currencies sprung up organically in Japan in that time period. And the other example, bigger scale example to point to is the VIR, W-I-R. It's a Swiss-based complementary currency that's a business-to-business credit system that has been around for decades. I forget the history of it. But it too sort of flexes, wanes, and I forget the word. I'm not thinking clearly, but when the banking system contracts in a recession, the usage of the VIR increases. So it's like a resilience building shock absorber. And that's a very active, large system that makes the Swiss economy more resilient and more able to withstand shocks than it would be without that. Now, Bernard, toward the end of his life, was pretty down on there were a bunch of what are essentially pet projects using complementary currencies, but none of them all of them together didn't add up to something that was actually going to change the global economy. They were all small projects, which is the way they need to start. But when he learned about blockchain and crypto, he suddenly said, we finally have a technology that can make this scale, both in terms of the numbers of different complementary currencies, the definitions of them, the designs of them, but also the ability to monitor and manage them without using shoeboxes and paper. And I know he got very involved in one of the early crypto companies. I forget which one it is. But so I agree that there's lots of potential with the blockchain technology and the concept of crypto. But I'm afraid that I'll call it the Wall Street tech bro culture kind of took over. And, we saw what happened. We watched the movie play out, right? And, watching that movie play out as someone who worked on Wall Street, then watched the financial crash play out and was shocked. This was shock to the 10x in terms of the brazenness, the scale, the insanity. And so, in summary, I think there's lots of value underneath the hood on this crypto blockchain possibility for currencies. But unfortunately, the irresponsibility of not just a few bad actors, but a lot of bad actors has ruined it, at least, for the time being. But it'll come back. And, the dot-com crash, there's tons of, what we now call refi businesses that were invented in 2000 during the dot-com period and then crashed because it got silly. Same ideas, but new technology. So I'm quite optimistic that blockchain will play a role in facilitating a more diversified currency system that is more resilient than the current one. But I'm not smart enough to predict or indicate how that's going to play out. And of course, now we've got AI that's soaking up all the oxygen and capital in the world. So I don't know, you guys probably know better than I what's happened to all these refi experiments.
And I love your historical approach and looking at other cases, across the globe. Speaking of holistic view, right? And I love the concept of complementary currency and some of the ideas that existed before, the crypto boom. And we've talked a lot about, what's wrong with the current financial system, how, technology may or may not improve that. But I'm curious to look into the future as we conclude the episode, it takes me back to the course in regenerative economics that I took with you. We had this thing there, practice labs, where, we took all these ideas and we actually had to come up with solutions and examples. And I remember that was actually the hardest thing for me in the course. So if I may, I want to put you in that seat a little bit. And can you paint a picture of your ideal world where finance is truly regenerative, or maybe give an example of a case that you can say, like, look, this is where finance is truly serving life. So, and just generally your take on the future of finance.
Sure. You asked for it. I think this is going to be hard to articulate without a lot of context around it. But remember the three mountain diagram in the course? So for your listeners, I have a slide where I have essentially drawn three mountains, and the middle mountain has a big bag of money on the top of it. And the other two mountains are labeled social capital and ecological or natural capital. So I've simplified the world into financial capital, social capital, and ecological capital. And of course, that's a way oversimplification, but for the purpose of the description, I think people get the idea. And then I've pointed out that the algorithm we run the world on is designed to grow the central mountain, the financial capital mountain, increasingly because of the scale of the economy at the expense of the other two mountains. So you've got the central mountain going higher and the other two mountains shrinking. And that's the polycrisis in a nutshell. And so the question is, how do we adjust that at a macro scale? Forget about little projects. Of course, there's all kinds of little projects that are regenerative. Wonderful. I could put a solar panel on my roof and pay for it out of my wallet, and it's regenerative. But what the question is, how do we shift the system? And the answer to that is both simple and profoundly complex. If the three capitals, again, in my simplified world, are out of balance and moving further out of balance because of the algorithm, which I believe is objectively the case, it's the system designed to do that, then the only way I can think of to shift the system is, and again, looking to living life as a metaphor, well, what does life do? It composts. So we need to compost financial capital back into natural and social capital, which is the process of life. There's a cycle of life. And we set up a system where financial capital doesn't obey the cycle of life. And our little relatively minuscule nods to philanthropy are, in a sense, the current version of composting capital. The problem is that the purpose, direction, and scale is off by orders of magnitude. So to answer your question, the real answer to your question is that we are going to need to understand that it is in all of our interests that this surplus financial capital be recycled, recomposted, whatever word we want to use, regenerated into other forms of capital. And that isn't all philanthropy. That is both investment. In our current language, that's both investment and philanthropy, but it's optimizing life rather than optimizing financial returns. And how we do that is complicated, and, come take our course. I've got lots of ideas on it, but it probably begins at the foundation layer, which is regenerating the biological, ecological systems that support all life. And so this movement toward bioregional, place-based, landscape scale regeneration, to me, is the natural place to start. And so regenerating forests, regenerating grasslands, regenerating mangroves, all of that is think of it as a sector or an industry that doesn't exist, that needs to be understood as the most important industry, regardless of what the financial returns on it are. Some of it will have positive financial returns, some of it will have negative financial returns, but it has to happen. But then there's layers above that are also imperative. And if we do all that, and here's where the technology, to me, the excitement with technology comes in, is that if we're not stupid about technology, which we tend to be, but if we're not stupid about it, the value creation using digital tools obviously is way lower material throughput than the value creation building metal buildings or building metal bridges or digging in the ground for coal and oil. So if we do the hard stuff right, it leaves massive potential to do the fun stuff, which will fall into categories of, lifelong learning, spiritual development, caring for each other, all the stuff that makes life worth living. There's unlimited potential there because it's very low material throughput. But we've got to get our act together on the stuff that's high material throughput and not just be prisoners to this finance algorithm that everything needs to grow, everything needs to optimize short-term financial return, or it's not worth doing. And that's exactly what, this guy Peltz, the activist investor, he's come into Unilever and said, the financial performance is substandard. We need to change it. Well, no, you don't. Maybe we're selling all the soap we really need to be selling right now. And we need to do other things with our capital. And how we get the world to behave that way is the big question. And I wish I had more answers. But it's going to take both carrots and sticks. That's for sure. And probably more sticks than we free market advocates like to believe.
Oh, yeah. Well, truly inspirational. But I like that there's a lot of realism to it as well. And I love this idea of composting capital. I've heard it before in some of your previous Discovery dialogues. And I think that's a very cool concept, which we can learn a lot from. And I wish we could talk for hours, but we need to wrap up the episode. And what we like to do with each of our guests is end with rapid fire questions. So we're going to ask you a few questions and you can be, as brief as you can. Are you ready?
Okay.
Cool. So
I like this challenge.
A little challenge. What book are you currently reading?
Oh, I just finished Master and The Master and His Emissary. Highly recommended. Left Brain, Right Brain.
Thank you.
Ian McGilchrist.
Awesome. I want to know what excites you the most about your work.
Helping people see through new eyes a optimistic path.
Beautiful. And lastly, what's the one lesson, quote, or mantra that has shaped you the most as a person?
When I started Capital Institute, there's a Goethe quote, which I'll butcher, but it's something like, I can't remember. It's something about, just begin. There's energy in starting, so just begin. I can't remember the actual quote, but that's really what I decided to do when I started Capital Institute. I had all these ideas, couldn't figure out exactly what it was supposed to be, what I was supposed to do, but I just began. And that was a good decision, but I can't remember the quote. There's boldness there's boldness in beginning or something like that.
I think that's a really great call to action for our listeners. Thank you, John, so much for joining us. All good. It was such an honor to have you on the episode. We'll definitely link your work in the show notes. And yeah, thank you for joining us. This was such a powerful Regeneration 101, and I'll definitely be taking your course.
Oh, good. Yeah, and please share with your listeners. The next econ course starts in September, so it's perfect timing to get ready. It'll run 8 weeks. It runs 2 sessions a week for 2 hours each session, so it's manageable as a sidekick. And the next refi course, Regenerative Finance course, we're halfway through it. There's actually a module on money and banking that'll start, I think, in November. And then next year, we'll probably run the whole thing again. So, but it's all on our website, capitalinstitute.org.
We will make sure to add all the links to the episode description. So yes, definitely recommend check it out with live community as well. Yeah, and John's work, your white paper, your book. Thanks again so much for your insights. Really such deep concepts explained in such digestible way. I think it's going to be a ton of value for our audience. Thanks again.
Great.
Hope to chat soon.
I appreciate you the opportunity. And actually, I should mention, we just put out an on-demand course that just focuses on the 8 principles of living systems. So that's sort of the easy, better than reading a paper, but not the full course. And again, it's on the website, but it's all self-paced and much easier to get started. So that might be of interest as well.
Perfect.
That's a good primer on ecology for all of your tech builders out there.
Yeah, and if you're looking for a place to begin your learnings on regeneration, this self-paced course sounds like the perfect place to start.
Yeah, that would be good. It's the beginning, essentially, of the full course. So anyway, well, thank you guys for having me. It's great to see you again.
Thank you.
All righty.